This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Who benefits when Kenya is underfoot? Okay. Dustin Bata is a development and humanitarian researcher, joins us in the hot seat of the Situation Room this morning. Dustin, good morning.
Morning, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Timothy Kiprono is a public finance, governance and climate finance expert, joins us also in the Situation Room this morning. Good morning.
Great, good morning to you.
Karibu sana.
Asante.
I can already tell you that there might be some interesting opinions coming out of this conversation this morning, because who benefits? We may know them, but we may not call them out. Today, we'll call them out in terms of who benefits, but also finding solutions as to these disasters and what can actually be done. As you know, or you may not know, we go around the African continent every week. We come back from a particular country with its proverbs. This week, we've been in Guinea. In Francophone Africa, Francophone West Africa specifically. And our proverb, we'd love to get your interpretation of it. Your beauty will take you there, but your character will bring you back. Your beauty will take you there, but your character will bring you back. Start with you, Dustin. What do you think about that? How would you interpret that?
I think it's an excellent proverb, and I love how it's, okay, maybe beauty is getting you into opening certain doors in certain scenarios, and then it's about where do you come back to in terms of your character and accountability and commitment to ideas beyond the superficial nature of your beauty, is my interpretation.
Okay. What do you think?
Yeah, it's very interesting analogy of I would think about, for example, relate to systems. We have very beautiful systems in Kenya. For example, we have laws and frameworks for just relating to this particular subject. But when it comes to applying them, you realize it's not beautiful, and not as strong as they are, but they could be strong. But if you don't take care of your beauty, it just shows eventually who you are. You do nice makeup, and when you take off the makeup, for example, then or you don't take care of it, then it kind of exposes you. So I think it's our systems as well. Yeah,
indeed. Okay, so there are many things that countries go through that would be deemed as disaster. We hear about them and we think floods, we think about famine, and we think about drought and all of that. But there are other things that can be happening. Economic disaster, very possible that, improper use of resources around the country can also be deemed as disaster. There are things that keep us down. Off the top of it, Timothy, we start with you. Are there things, or are there folks who are benefiting when a country like Kenya is not doing so well in particular areas?
Of course.
Okay.
Well, okay, so crisis economy. So maybe just let me start there and say that, yes, we have, or well, rather, we don't just have crisis economy. We also have another one, which is redistributional economy. What happens when disaster happens is that, resources move quickly, and these resources are moves in billions. And it kind of like creates a justification to move resources from development, for example, to response. And in that kind of situation, there are people, of course, who benefit. Political and budget actors, find justification to move resources from things that were planned for before to something else. And this something else, of course, in the sense that of crisis, is that I'll call it a black box for citizens, because they don't know how that money is used. And they're not involved in the movement of that money. And then eventually, of course, participation is also very limited in that sense. So the political actors, the budget actors also benefit from that. The second kind of actors are also, market, movers. When emergency happens, procurement systems are changed from open procurement in development. If you move money from development, it would have gone through open procurement systems. But now, because it's emergency, you put, you hold on to, you hold your open procurement to kind of apply what is called direct procurement, for example. Then prices also also go up, and the suppliers benefit from that. And so there are probably people who would like the crisis to continue, so that then, the business opportunities also happen. And then the last kind of actors, of course, external actors. So in the case of county governments, for example, national government come in to support, but also humanitarian actors. So we're talking about NGOs and other people who bring money to the economy. And part of the reason that happens is that because our systems break down. And of course, there are other reasons why, humanitarian actors also come into play and benefit from that.
Wow. Dustin, humanitarian aid, relief aid, emergency response is all meant to be a good thing, because it is meant to come in and create an intervention or you have a disaster, mitigate against loss of life, mostly, and also maybe move people to where life can be more sustainable. So when resources are rapidly moved, it is a good thing, because it means we can have action in time, and we can have minimal losses, if at all. But that seems not to be the case, because we have a long history, especially in our country, Kenya, or in Africa, large, and also in other like Middle East countries, where you have long-going humanitarian aid provision. But you don't see the impact of that aid. It is short-lived. Of course, the impact is seen from the beneficiaries or the benefactors, but the people who are supposed to receive this aid or intervention or support, rarely do we see actual sustainable impact. How would you, in your own assessment, rate that impact analysis?
That's an excellent question, and this is a lot of what we cover in our report, Governing Inequality, Kenya's State, Aid Politics and Perpetual Humanitarian Crisis. And there is this kind of tension between this need and urgent, pressing need to save lives, which is invaluable, and that is critical. But again, this kind of focus on the short-term dynamics without addressing what are the underlying causes and drivers of people to be vulnerable in the first place. So if we look at Kenya as the focus of our study, but this happens in many other countries, in Kenya you have 200 to 400 million US dollars coming in every year to kind of alleviate this human suffering, save lives. But there's no real effort to kind of address why are people vulnerable in the first place. And across the arid and semi-arid lands, which make up, a huge part of Kenya, a lot of those populations living in those areas suffer from lack of investment, lack of infrastructure, access to water, access to jobs, access to social services. And so when a crisis strikes, whether it's drought, whether it's flood, and this happens all the time in Kenya, then they are kind of hit and extremely vulnerable. And then the international system steps in, and it's kind of this rinse and repeat every single year without going, okay, how do we actually invest in these communities to make sure they are resilient in the first place? And this has been going on for years and years, and there are a lot of vested interests in the way this aid economy has been established. So we need to kind of go beyond the short-term thinking, which is really more around looking at structural inequalities and also like governance issues in Kenya and elsewhere.
Okay. So is the aid industry helping to perpetuate historical and geographical inequalities in Kenya? And is it posing a barrier to state-led crisis response? Is it?
I think absolutely. I think there are so many vested interests within the aid system from many donors. If we look at a lot of the US actions, particularly of late, so the US is really weaponizing and politicizing aid in Kenya, across the world. There's also not just the crisis response, but the US funding around health systems in Kenya, and then the kind of extraction of data that was proposed with that, extremely controversial. But then within, if you look at all the aid actors in Kenya, you have nearly all the funding, over 90%, flows to international actors, UN agencies and international non-government organisations. And so all these actors control 90% plus of the funding coming in. They all have vested interest to expand their programs and kind of keep the aid industry going on. And if you start to genuinely address the structural inequalities and the governance issues in Kenya, then you don't really need the aid system to do nearly all that it's doing. So it's about trying to break out of that and get past these perpetual structural inequalities.
Okay.
Wow. It's interesting because keep
Yes.
on, right. The aid industry comes to start and step in to do what the government ought to be doing, what our public finance systems ought to be doing. Because our constitution provides for everything that a Kenyan need. In times there's a disaster, there's a disaster fund.
Yes.
You know, in times of any crisis, the constitutions provide. But then now the aid industry comes in, as Noe is asking, it comes to sort of interfere and sustain another culture where there is aid dependency. Does that, in your opinion, take away our structural strength? Because our institutions are not as strong as they ought to be. If we did not have the aid industry, maybe we would have revised to see our systems strong enough, resilient enough to withstand whatever shockers will come our way. It could be agricultural crisis, medical crisis, a natural calamity. How would you rate our institutional strength vis-a-vis the aid industry and now the violation of our public finance?
Absolutely. And that's a very interesting question in the sense that we start looking at, what kind of systems do we have in place and do they function, as it were. So you're very right that our legal framework provides for safeguards for, how we deal with this kind of crisis. The Constitution, first of all, when it kind of devolved system, kind of divided functions between national and county governments, gave counties mandate to deal with disasters as a primary actor.
Right.
And then allowed national government to come in to support counties in dealing with that, partially because counties are closer to people, so they are in a better place to respond.
Correct.
And so if you look at PFM, for example, Act, Section 110, it mandates all counties to establish an emergency fund. And this emergency fund is supposed to be a fund. You take money out of your regular budget and put it aside. So that money is supposed to be, the reason why it sits aside outside the regular system is because it's for rapid response. Rapid response means if it floods now, we don't need to go looking for money in the budget because you cannot plan for an emergency as the regular, the way you plan for your salaries and other things. And so every county in Kenya have an emergency fund, or at least it's expected to have an emergency fund. And then we have several other instruments. Of course, Section 116 of the PFM Act allows counties to set up other instruments. At national level, we have the National Drought Emergency Fund, which is supposed then to also deal with, you can see by the name, is the drought, and so forth. Now,
I thought the name was supposed to, but it's okay.
Yeah. So you can see already we have instruments in place. So at the county level, you have emergency fund, you have disaster risk management fund, and then you have something else called county climate change fund, which is supported by, if you've heard of something called FLOCA, supported by World Bank. Now, these instruments are supposed to do three things. One is response, rapid response, which is the emergency fund. The disaster risk management fund is supposed to be an active instrument, looking back and looking forward to say, if we responded, what did we respond to and what caused that response? And then use that information to inform the investment for the future. How do we build resilience? Now, the aid either strengthens the system or weakens the system. Now,
in our case?
Yes. In our case, it actually weakens in a lot of ways because we've seen in counties, the emergency fund is not even feasible. Communities don't have an idea about it exists. We went to Garissa, Marsabit, and Tana River and asked citizens whether they know the emergency fund. And most of them were like, no, we even don't know. Now, if they don't know, the primary instrument that is supposed to respond to the disasters and the challenges they face every day, then what is the purpose of that fund? What they know is the humanitarian aid. They know that, World Vision comes with money, for example. And then they also know that, the people who respond to disasters are NGOs. Then what it means is that our systems are not doing what it's supposed to do. And the challenge here is that when humanitarian actors come and run parallel systems to the systems that exist, then they're not serving the purpose that they should serve, which is come and support systems that are
already functioning.
Yes.
Yeah.
So work with it, develop it, so that even if they're not there, then the systems can continue function. Take, for example, what happened to USAID. USAID, when they exited, what happened to healthcare?
Crisis.
We almost collapsed. Now imagine a situation where humanitarian actors also exit the space, while our systems have been weakened because governors know, NGOs will come and respond, right? And so they don't strengthen the emergency fund, for example. So it becomes a problem.
When you hear this, Dustin, and also we can borrow examples from across the globe, actually. aid industry thrives in corrupt systems. Aid industry has been here with us for decades. How do you justify the refinancing of interventions that clearly you can see they're not strengthening the local systems and the impact to the people, to the populace, because there has to be accountability, there has to be sustainability, is not at par? How do you justify the continuous thriving of the aid industry, especially now in countries where these systems are weak and corrupt?
Another excellent question. I think there's a few dynamics going on from this point Timothy was making, which is really excellent. Like a lot of countries I've worked in, you go to different communities and you ask, okay, if you had a problem or if you ran out of money or food, who would you go to? And often the answer is, this NGO or this UN agency. And that is kind of reflective of a lot of the dynamics we are talking about. But in terms of the corruption, I think there's really this nuance, which is kind of a difficult balance to kind of go along. That, okay, yes, corruption and illicit financial flows are a big issue in many countries, but the idea of just suddenly cutting off aid and doing essentially shock therapy is extremely dangerous, because you have this whole system that just collapses, as we saw to some degree last year, and may actually escalate even further this year in Kenya, Somalia, across the world. And that means a lot of people dying and potential famine in many locations. So this sudden shock therapy is not the way to do it. It's how do you go through a staged process of handing over, and also looking towards those long-term solutions, but also focusing on aspects like civic space, civil society activity to hold authorities accountable, rather than just going, okay, we're going to cut off aid that can be extremely disruptive. So some of our research also looks at, in parallel to the aid system, you actually have illicit financial flows in Kenya that are about 1.5 billion annually, and this is reported by multiple different sources. And so if you start to tackle that, the aid money becomes less relevant. But if you don't tackle the illicit financial flows first, cutting off aid is deeply irresponsible. And there is also this one element as well of a lot of aid props up negative things, but then there is a lot of accountability systems within a lot of aid. So a lot of donors impose very strict conditionalities. And so not the entire system is corrupt per se, but it kind of feeds into a lot of problematic governance dynamics in many countries.
And you see those governance dynamics somehow, they allow or create room for infiltration now of culture, because there's also the social impact, the social aspect of it. When parallel programs are being run by the government and the aid community, we've seen cases in various countries whereby there's a bit of a clash between culture, because this will come with an organized agenda. This is what they are offering as aid, as an intervention. However, they would want this community to respond in this particular manner. So how do we find the safety nets, or the safeguards for the communities that are vulnerable at the time? Because everybody who is seeking aid at the time, they are vulnerable, be they an individual, a community, or a government. How do we say, do we have safeguards from exploitation? Is there a monitoring scheme where you'd be able to say, okay, this aid comes in this form and manner, this is the expected impact, however, we need to be cautious of these ramifications? What are the safeguards we have, and how is that looking like from the report? What points of exploitation did you discover from the aid community that now the local administration needs to be very, on the outlook?
I can list off some very bad examples. Previously working in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, at the Rohingya genocide. And I arrived, went round, and there were accountability boxes where people could put in a note saying, they have an issue or concern about something. This is for a population that basically was not particularly literate. All the signs were in a language they didn't understand. And unsurprisingly, all the boxes were empty. So it's like there was an accountability system in theory, but not actually used. Then you have other dynamics, like going back to, I was in Kenya in 2012, up in Kakuma and Turkana, and you had excellent, Canary, the Kakuma News Reflector, like a locally led, refugee-run outlet for holding the aid system to account. And then it reported on different issues, but it really faced so much pressure from UN agencies and from others to not report on aid problems, aid misuse. And so you have these kind of excellent, very effective, like refugee-run systems such as Canary, but then they face these immense pressures because there is a lot of pushback from different aid actors to avoid accountability. But at the same time, there are more boring processes such as procurement of getting, various quotes and other aspects that there is degrees of accountability, and it's certainly improved. I think there's been some innovations in certain countries around using mobile phone-based or text messages to improve accountability. So it does exist. It has improved in many ways, but the other examples in Bangladesh and Kakuma and Drakana are examples of things that still have a long way to go.
Wow.
Let's take a break on this point. We'll come back because the question then I have at top of mind, a bit of a teaser, is then it appears to me that there is an advantage to keep things as just operational by those who give the aid, because then if you keep me begging and wanting, then perhaps you can control me. We'll talk a little bit about that when we come back from this break. It's 9:30 and we're looking at, who benefits from Kenya's disasters? The issue of aid, we're looking into that as well. And maybe another question, isn't it time that you actually say, cut off the aid so that you force a situation where countries are able to operate optimally? Perhaps that should be the goal. We'll come back and we'll continue with that. When we look at traffic and weather, we'll be back after this.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.